Hello, Spark fans, and welcome back to Advancing Spark, where we are having a Delta sharing dive thing. Yeah, so Delta sharing been announced for over a year. We've been hearing about it a lot, and we've had the open protocol out on the delta.io site for quite some time. But it required a lot of fiddling, to be fairly honest. I had a quick go. I set up my own little local Delta sharing server, and when it came to actually needing to access things on cloud storage, I had to install all the Hadoop distributions, which meant I had to install a lot of Java things, and it got to the point I was like, yeah, okay, that's not a quick thing I can set up to show you guys as a demo. But the big news is, so as part of the Unity Catalog rollout, so Unity Catalog's currently in public preview. They announced at the Data AI Summit like 3 weeks ago now, that it'll be coming GA in the next few weeks. So we're expecting it very, very soon. Delta sharing is part of that as well. So if you don't want to host your own open source Delta sharing server, you can just tick a few buttons inside Databricks itself if you have Unity Catalog enabled and say, make this a Delta sharing server. And then that'll do a lot of the setup and the install for you. And I wanted to put that to the test and go, well, how easy does it work? So that's what we're doing today. We are having a look at a metastore that I've ticked the button and said, yes, please make this a Delta sharing server. A share that I've set up. So one of the workspaces attached to that metastore, I've said, share that data. There's a table, make it available, give it to this person over there. And then another workspace in a different AD tenant with no credentials at all related can spin up, test it, sign up as that recipient, and see if we can access data. That is the plan. That is what we're doing today. Just seeing how the different components of Delta sharing actually fits together and works. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe. And let me know what use cases you guys have got for Delta sharing. Are you thinking of building data products and then so you're eventually thinking of things like the Databricks marketplace? Do you have a big federated organization and they're all in different AD tenants and everything's scattered everywhere, but you still want to share data? And so you're thinking about building a mesh using something like Delta sharing as the key fundamental common language. Loads of different use cases. Really interested to hear what people are doing with it. But first, let's go and have a look at what we do. So, first things first, I've got my accounts page. Now the accounts page is the thing I introduced when we were talking about Unity Catalog. And we've got a few different metastores because it was broken for UK South. Boo. But I have a workspace, a metastore here. This is one you can see I've got it set up with 2 existing workspaces. So the one I'm going to be working with is Advancing Unity. That's where I'm going to build my share. I'm going to work on creating and adding things to my share. That's a workspace which is currently associated with my main metastore. And inside that metastore, cheeky little button, enable Delta sharing to allow a Databricks user to share data outside their org. That's saying, please, Databricks, act like an open source Delta sharing server for me. Enable all the config, enable all the extra things to allow me to share data, which is great that we have the ability to turn it on or off at the organizational level, at the metastore level. And yeah, there's a few things we can do. One thing to note, we have a recipient token lifetime. So when I set someone up as a recipient of data, when I say to someone, there you go, you're allowed to see data that I'm sharing, how long does their access last for until they need to re-register and re-sign up as a user? In this case, it's a day. Everything I'm showing and going through today, by tomorrow, we won't be able to use any of the same stuff. You won't be able to steal my credentials and get hold of the New York taxi data. Oh, I think I'll be okay. It's fine. But yeah, we have control. How long does granting access last for? Now, in reality, if we're setting up a real share between people, we're going to need a lot longer than a day. But we also have the ability to do things like token recycling. Recycle a token every 30 days, 90 days. You should have some kind of management of the data you're sharing, but you can do that now. So step 1, inside our account screen, enable that Delta sharing on the metastore that we're working with. Then I'm going to step into Databricks proper. Now, as a quick reminder for people on the Azure side of things, you can get to that account console from that settings, manage account, if you're not used to seeing it, because it's fairly new in the Azure side of things. Okay, so I need something to share. So I've got a few things. Create catalog taxi share, create a database, what's technically a schema or a database. What is it? So that's taxi share.nyc taxis. Then I'm adding a table saying, well, I just had an existing table, so I'm creating a managed table saying taxi share, NYC taxis, yellow taxi sample. That is just a managed table. Boo. But managed tables and external tables work a bit differently in Unity catalog, and we'll talk about that in a future video. But essentially, I'm just making sure I have a database, and in there, I've got a store. I have a catalog in my metastore. I've got a database in that catalog, and I've got a table in there that I want to share. That yellow taxi sample, that's what I'm trying to get other people access to. I want people to go in here and be able to click a few buttons and then to be able to query that table as if it was their own. So step 1, 2 technically, is going through and creating that. So I've got this 3-part naming. I can go taxi share.nyc taxis.yellow taxi sample, and I get some data. So far, so good. That's just straightforward Unity catalog things. Got an extra part in my naming. That's it. Then we get on to the interesting stuff. So because I have enabled all of this, because this is a Unity catalog synced metastore, and that Unity catalog has Delta sharing enabled, I can just use that simple SQL syntax, create a share. I create a new share called taxis. And that goes off, talks to the metastore, registers it, and I get a little thing back saying, yep, done. We can now refer to a thing called taxis. And that's like a general, like virtual bucket of tables that I've allocated or revoked from there. Currently at that point, I'll have nothing in there. I mean, so you can do things like show shares, variable capitalization. So you can see I've got one thing in there. You can do that. You can do show me the tables that are currently in my share. It acts like any other SQL object with the kind of Spark SQL syntax. Then you can see we're saying, right, okay, so I've created the bucket. I created my share. I need to add a table. I'm taking my already SQL registered table. I'm doing alter share taxis for that thing we just created, that empty bucket. I want to add that table to it. At that point, whenever someone looks at that share of taxis, they'll get a list of tables that are in there. And in this case, it would just say there's one table in there, and it's taxi share.nyc taxis.yellow taxi sample. How we refer to that registered table. Again, a few new concepts, a few new objects that we're setting up. A share is essentially just a database. It's a different kind of database. It's a logical container of tables that are stored in other databases elsewhere, just so we can use it as a sharing mechanism. Now, we then need to do this. We need to create a recipient. So essentially, each different subscribing organization, subscribing person, really anyone who's trying to try and authenticate with this share and be granted access or not granted access accordingly, needs to be set up as a recipient. So in this case, I created the recipient assignment because I'm going to grab it in a different workspace. In this case, it then gave me an error because that recipient already existed. So we had to do something else. Got another person. And then that generates a token. It generates this person. So kind of we have this another SQL object, another object in our sharing protocol called a recipient. You can see it's token-based authorization, and they've got an active token ID. So that is the bearer token. The various things, if you're looking through the Delta sharing documentation, it'd be like, right, you need a profile file, you need a bearer token, you need a URL where you're going to, and there's various different things it gives you. Actually, that's not even the bearer token, that's the token ID. We'll get the bearer token in a second. But so there's different bits of content that you need. Now, the most important part is this thing. So that is a URL that you give to your recipient. Give that to your recipient to say, there you go, I've shared something with you. You can get set up using this. And what that does is it generates a file for them. It generates a thing called a profile file. And I was going all the way through the various kind of delta.io documentation going, what? Where do I get that from? Where's it generated from? It took a while to actually just find the fact we can do that here. I did have a little play. What we can also do is via the CLI, we can do that as well. You might have seen in the Unity catalog one, there was an extension to the Databricks CLI called Unity Catalog. So you can download the Databricks Unity Catalog CLI that extends the Databricks CLI. And in there, I was able to create a recipient for a given profile with a given name. And that's just the same thing. So we get the same thing generated. We get the whole thing, and we get, very importantly, again, that URL. And that URL is the most important part. Getting a URL that we can give to the recipient. So whether you want to do it programmatically, whether you want to do it through SQL, whether you want to do it through the Python or Scala APIs, you can get at it lots of different ways. But essentially, we need to do this. We need to generate this recipient and then give them a URL. So we'll go to that. Right. Yes, please. I would like to access that share. So this is the user. This is the recipient themselves. I've sent them a URL. They pop it in. They hit go. They click on the random URL I'm going to send them. And trust that everything's okay. And you get this. You've been given access to a data set through Delta sharing. Download a credential file. Download that file. It opens up. VS Code doesn't see what it is. Let's just tell it that it's JSON. I can show you what it actually looks like. Okay, so we get this. So this is the syntax for a profile file. Really simple. 4 attributes. Credentials version is just compatibility stuff. The bearer token. So that is their unique token credential password that they can use to access my share. And again, because we had that setting right at the start, it's got a 1 day. It's got a 24-hour lifespan. So after that expiry date's gone, that token will no longer be allowed to be used. And then it's got an endpoint. So this is now, that's the URL you can get to go to my metastore if you have the right bearer token. So these bits all coming together of now I've got a Delta share server because Unity Catalog built one for me. I've got built a share inside it. And now I've got the key components that a recipient needs to be able to connect into that share. Essentially, most of the Delta sharing APIs say, cool, either give me this file in itself, give me a whole file that has these 4 attributes in there, or give me these 2 bits. I want the bearer token and I want the endpoint. Give me those 2 and I can figure the rest out and I can actually manage to connect. So important, that file, super important. And as it says on the website, can only be downloaded once. You can't actually get to that again. So it's essentially that is your one-off activation URL email. You can ping over to someone, get that. So we've done that. We've grabbed that bit of profile. We've got the info that we need. That wouldn't work in itself. So if I went through the process now and jumped over to the recipient, tried to connect to my Delta share, go on to taxis, I go, yeah, what's there? And it would say nothing. Don't have access to any shares within this metastore. Because all I've done at this point, I just created a recipient. That recipient has no relation to that share. So we need to create recipients, essentially creating users of our sharing protocol. And then we need to say, well, this recipient can access this share. This recipient can access these tables in that share. There's a permissions model about what recipients can do because they're initially created just an entirely separate entity that could be added to loads of different shares. So we do this exactly. Grant select on my share to that recipient. And that means when I log in, when I connect, authenticate from whatever other thing I'm using into my Delta sharing server, it'll go, oh yeah, cool. You're allowed to see taxis and everything in there. So that's kind of a bit of a bucket one. I'm saying just give it access to the share of taxis. Anytime anyone adds a table into that taxi share, my recipient will be able to see it and be able to work with it. Recipient shares, we can go dig into all those different things to see what is going on. And that's all we need to do as a sharer. So I've created my share, I've created my recipient, I've enabled my recipient to authenticate with my metastore, and I've added the table I want my recipient to see into a share that they have access to. That's all the config over on my sharing side. On the recipient, there's a few other bits and pieces to do. And I've switched over. I've done this in Python on the recipient side. You don't need to. You can do it in SQL. But there's a few things I just wanted to show you. Part of it is because I wanted to be able to install the Delta sharing protocol. Just because it's not installed by default yet. At least it wasn't when I first tried playing with Delta sharing. There's a point, certainly by the time Delta sharing goes GA, I'm pretty sure this will just be installed by default on all Databricks runtimes, and so you won't need to do this. I could have not been lazy and just checked, but I haven't. Most important part. Okay, so we've installed that. So if you're trying to play with it, if you're in your own Spark environment, you're doing this locally, you if you're using Python or any of the other various different languages that connect into delta sharing, you'll need to do something along those lines. You need to install the language-dependent library to talk to delta sharing so that you can use all the functions. Doing that to start things off. Next, so lots of the delta sharing functions look for a profile file. So rather than just the various attributes we had inside that file that we received as a recipient when someone sent us that URL, it just wants a file there. So in some of the demo kind of examples that Databricks put out, they had this kind of thing. So just a little bit hacky for me. I want to put a file locally, put it there, and then just dump the same in there. Essentially, I'm just recreating that config.share file that I downloaded, but I'm just putting it into DBFS, putting it into the local Databricks file system, so it has somewhere it can go and query that data. Okay, so I've got that. I have my credentials. Again, if I run that, it's going to tell me off because the file already exists. Yeah, it's fine. It's already there. We've already ran this to make sure it works. And then we can do a few bits. So we can say, well, I want to start delta sharing. So import that library. So the top bit was installing the various library files on the cluster. This is now instantiating that namespace so it can actually access the functions inside it. Hang on, new thing called profile, call it that DBFS sharing config.share. You need the DBFS prefix for that function. Other places in Databricks you wouldn't need to do that. You know it's DBFS. It's a little bit of syntax. You just need to tell it, go look in DBFS for this. I'm creating something called a client. And that's my sharing client. So in delta sharing client, I can go see what it is. I'm going to kind of build that up again. And my client is, I can do my delta sharing. Should now see that's now a function that it recognizes because I've imported it. What's the various things I can do in there, and I've got the full lots of things I can do and have a play around with. In this case, we're creating that sharing client so we can actually then kind of call it with the context of those credentials and that bearer token. And then just keep passing it that variable. And then the only reason I showed this client is just to show that that object that's been instantiated actually is a delta sharing client. Okay, so little bit awkward, that part. I'm sure this will get more slick in the future. We can just kind of register with Delta rather than downloading the file separately, moving it around and copying and pasting all that part. Sure, it should be a lot slicker in future going, register as a share. Hit a button there, paste the URL in. But currently, because it's built to be open source and because it's built to be not someone using Databricks, someone using Spark elsewhere, someone using local Python or Tableau or Power BI, we can actually do that same stuff. So we've got our client. We can do things like that. We can say list all the tables that's currently in that share that I can see. You can say, well, actually, could be a big array of all the tables I can see. In fact, there's one object in my array. There's a table. You can see it's my yellow taxi sample in my taxi share in NYC Taxi. So it's exposed going, right, in the share that you have access to, this is what you can see. So I might see multiple shares in there. Might see loads of tables inside the same share, whatever we've provisioned to the given recipient I'm connecting as. And then we can build up. So I can say profilers, note, annoying having to switch the version of DBS over rather than /DBFS is now DBFS : because protocols work differently. But essentially, if we're building up a table URL, whether we're writing things in SQL, whether we're writing things in Python or Scala, lots of things when we're saying, this is the table I want to load, I want you to give essentially a 4-part naming, which is that profile file, and a hash sign or a pound sign for Americans, and then the 3 parts of my catalog, my schema, and then my table name. As you can see, I'm saying, well, my profile, that file with my connection credentials is here, then my share, then my schema name, then my yellow taxi. I'm just jamming it into an F string to build up that 4 parts, building out that table URL, and then it can say delta sharing load as Spark. And that just returns a Spark data frame object from my table URL I can then go and read. Again, no credentials here. This workspace is an entirely different AD tenant. This is my local personal tenant. And we can see, I can go and query that data. It looks and feels like it was querying something that was mounted onto this particular Databricks workspace. There we go. That is an end-to-end share. So we've set our metastore to say, yes, please, will you please be a data sharing server for me? Done our sharing setup to create a share, add a table to the share, create a recipient, grant access for that recipient to those shares. And then I've registered as that recipient to make sure I can connect to it. And I've been able to receive a table. Now that in itself is pretty darn cool. However, there's one thing that makes me even happier, and that is this. So, ignoring the world of Databricks and just going into Power BI, I could say, I want to get some data. And then it'll come up and it'll give me a list of my various different get data protocols that I've got. I'm going to say, I want to use Delta sharing. So built into Power BI now is the Delta sharing protocol. I could say I want to connect to that. Apologies, that's a little bit small. I was going to say, what's your Delta sharing URL? At that point, I can just throw the endpoint from that file. So the file that I had, dive in there and grab that endpoint out and go, okay, so that is my sharing endpoint. Okay. Going to ask me for my bearer token and go, well, what gives you the right to access this? I've done this before. And so I've already put my bearer token in, so it remembered my connection. Essentially, it comes up with the same box saying, what's your bearer token? I copied and pasted from that same bearer token I had in that profile file into that box, and it authenticates connection. You can see it's connecting to that metastore. I can see the sharer taxis. Under there, I can see the catalog and then the actual thing itself. So Power BI itself, without having to go through another recipient and without having to do a lot of the setup, I can just copy and paste those two details from that profile file into Power BI, and then I can connect and set it up as a data model. And that data model will just connect and work until that token expires. Again, if you're trying to do this to just set up a client with access to a limited share of data that you can onboard them without having to do loads of other networking and connection protocols, you can just give them access to a share, set the expiration date for that share, and off they go. And their report will happily work and happily refresh and direct query and all of that stuff until the point as their token expires. Pretty cool. Really, really cool. And yeah, that's about all I wanted to go through. So loads and loads of stuff in there. Now, I will say currently the documentation is interesting to try and actually work all those things out. Trying to look just for a straight reference of what all those new SQL commands are of create recipient, add recipient to a share, all of that stuff. I had to kind of scatter around lots of different demo blogs, getting started blogs, the delta.io documentation, which is really, really thorough, but fairly techy, fairly kind of hard to actually pull apart, and very much written as to people actually writing Python. So yeah, it's still very much preview, but as an actual thing you can get to work, as an actual protocol for sharing things across tenants, networks, things, without having to create IDs for people in various different things, you can see it definitely has promise. It definitely has a load of really, really cool stuff in there. I mean, there's questions about how it works in some other scenarios. How does it work if there is a VNet and you are going from a very secure environment and you want to share a very limited subset of data? Given essentially all the Delta Share is doing is talking to your cloud storage, your Azure Data Lake Store Gen 2 in my case, talking to that storage, generating a temporary token, like assume the equivalent of a very short-lived SAS key, passing that over to the recipient's then accessing that cloud storage directly. Now, if we're talking about things that are networked and VNetted and heavily locked down, that recipient's not going to be able to have network access. But a protocol for actually managing that and managing the user access and managing the permissioning, great. Doesn't get around issues of what if I'm trying to share something from a very secure environment. To be fair, are you doing open sharing via a secure environment? Don't know. So it'll have interesting things when we talk about organizations trying to adopt it to a data mesh. And so you have this massively federated idea of all these different people, all these different teams and organizations, and maybe just big walls between the different kind of parts of the company or different companies in a giant group. Could they use this to do their data mesh style thing with actually just this vast array of different tables and different things spread all over the place? Don't know. Because of how do you deal if you're trying to share things, but there's actually security to the outside world. You don't want it available to the public internet. You want it available to different people who don't necessarily have access to things. I don't know how well that's going to work so far. But again, this is very, very early days for how this actually fits in and how this actually talks to each other. From I want to share data with somebody. How well does this work? Pretty well. once you've gotten over the fact that you've got that profile file, and you either have to open it and read bits out of it, or you have to dump it somewhere that things can see. That's the only awkward part. Apart from that, the fact that we can do almost everything in SQL makes it really accessible, really open. The fact that things like Tableau and Power BI have that connector built in, and we can just put the details in and it'll just connect and work as if it's going to a local data source. The fact that we can then have a central admin managing our various recipients, their expirations, various tables that are in the different shares. Again, all super useful, super promising stuff. So yeah, all new and exciting world. So that is all I wanted to go through today. As always, any questions, any thoughts, how are you guys going to use that? Are there any use cases you guys have in mind that you're looking at this going, oh, we could use it for X, Y, Z? Let us know down in the comments what you're planning with it. If you're currently using it, if there's any scenarios where you have it up and running and you are sharing data via Delta sharing, then absolutely let us know. I'd love to hear how people are actually getting on with it currently. And yeah, until we dig into the next one, as always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.